Hey everybody, Elizabeth Nader back with you, the Nader Narrative and Jersey First TV. Today's show is all about our beloved Constitution. And, there are certain people in this world who really esteem it more than others. And we have someone here to talk to you today, JR Carman. Welcome to the show. JR, how much do you love our Constitution?
Well, I would say that I certainly do love it quite a bit. I believe the Word of God would be number one, but the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution would be second. But it's a
you and I
pleasure to
share
be here,
that
and
love.
thank you for having me.
Well, absolutely. And we share that love for our founding documents, but you are an unusual person because you have spent really a lot of your life's work focusing on educating people on the Constitution, why it's important to understand it, how we need to even more so than ever embrace it and teach it to our children and all of that. So, JR, we're going to get into that, but I want you to share with the audience who may not know you your background and how you ended up really focusing on this, as well as the group New Jersey Constitutional Republicans. So tell us more about you.
Well, I have to attribute my desire to restore the Republican Party to my father, who used to watch the Today Show back in 1972 when Richard Nixon was running against George McGovern. And when George McGovern would come on the Today Show, my father would use some expletives. And I was wondering why he was so angry. So I became very interested in political theory. I became very interested in our American history, presidential history, constitutional history. So really it was my father's angst against George McGovern, who today would be widely respected as almost a moderate within the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And I really have to thank my father for that. But over the decades since then, we've seen the Republican Party move more towards a progressive stance rather than defending the Constitution like Abraham Lincoln did. And of course, the Constitution was under a horrible assault with the splitting of the nation and the Confederacy devising their own constitution, splitting the nation. And he had the responsibility of preserving the Constitution and supporting the Constitution, which is the oath that every president takes. Right. And I believe that the Republican Party needed to reinitiate the initial principles from which it was founded. And we go back to Lincoln and his articulation of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, as he talked about the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, meaning that all men are to be treated by the law equally, and no one given special privileges. And of course, the fact that the people don't know civics. They don't know what their rights are. That's what the study of civics are. It's knowing your rights and what to do as a good citizen. The founders, Elizabeth, as you're well aware, anticipated the people, the electorate, the citizens to be involved with their local, state, and federal governments. And we've seen an abrogation of that. And that's one of the reasons we have the turmoil that we do today, because of the lack of the participation and the lack of the intellectual grasp that the people need to know regarding the principles of the Declaration, regarding the Constitution. And so that's why I founded the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans in 2017. And I believe that, as the founders all mentioned, the importance of an educated electorate, and that really was the motivation behind creating the group and restoring the great glory and heritage of the Republican Party. In many ways, it's been forgotten. Many people don't know that we, the Republicans, passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, giving due process and equal protection to the freed slaves, and then giving the freed slaves the right to vote. These are all Republican amendments. And we need to restore that great heritage once again within the Republican Party today.
We have a lot of work to do, that is for sure. Let's talk about the Constitution, itself and the founding documents. Clearly, for anyone who studies it, I think it's hard to argue that it wasn't divinely inspired, and it has survived quite a long time. And as you talk about the fact that it survived the Civil War, which really threatened to tear the nation apart permanently. But I would say now again, once again, it is under attack, maybe in an unprecedented way. We're not seeing a civil war in terms of guns on a battlefield right now. God willing, that won't happen. But we're definitely seeing an assault on the Constitution. How did we get here, JR? What is it that brought us to a point where so many people are unaware of what the Constitution really says, and they're ignorant of their rights and therefore giving them up, frankly, and not in any way demanding that the government continue to protect them as was intended by the founders? How did we get here?
Well, it's a great question, Elizabeth. And you have to begin with the Declaration of Independence. That was the document that founded our nation. And we see the principle that the founders looked to in justifying their separation from the crown was the laws of nature and nature's God. So in many ways, we have eliminated the laws of nature and nature's God in our thinking, in our law enforcement system. We're considering criminals victims, and we're not allowing victims to be given due process and justice. That's one example of the deterioration, and it comes from the citizens. They don't understand the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which provides the unalienable God-given rights. The rights come from God, as we know, and this is what many people don't understand. The rights come from God. They're not given by Phil Murphy and the Democrats. They're given by God, and we saw a tremendous abuse of the constitutional liberties of the people through the COVID-19 lockdowns, which we've discussed a lot about. But overall, the fact is that we have stopped teaching the Declaration of Independence, its principles, Elizabeth. And then the Constitution is the protector of those principles. It's the conduit by which our liberties are protected. And the people have forgotten, or the people have not been taught these things. Only very few have. And a lot of our representatives, most of our representatives, Elizabeth, have no constitutional literacy whatsoever. And yet the very first thing they do is to put their hand on the Bible and put their right hand up and say they swear to support the Constitution. And yet it's a document they haven't read. And that includes our state constitution.
Right.
So it's really been deliberately through the education system. They have marginalized the Constitution and the principles of our Declaration. They've stopped teaching civics, and they've taught progressivism, and which now we know ties right into Marxism, as we see with critical theory in the schools, as opposed to the Constitution being taught. So our organization is interested in making the Constitution great again, or relevant again, if you will. And the principles of the Declaration of Independence always have to come first. But it's really because the people have given up. The people have given up their sovereignty because of lack of education and lack of involvement.
If you don't know what you have, you don't realize that you've lost it or getting near losing it. I want you to talk a little bit about one of the interesting aspects of the way our country was founded and its founding documents and Constitution, and that's the states' rights versus the federal rights. And we may have people listening who never learned this in school. And I think you're so right in that people that are in elected positions may have never read the Constitution. And certainly they probably never read the New Jersey Constitution, right? We're talking about two important documents that they're elected to uphold. But I want you to talk about the state versus federal a little bit, because I think that's an issue that has always made us unique as a country. And it's really at the forefront now of a lot of things that are going on. Explain that to people, please.
Right. Well, the concept of federalism is the fact that there are two governments that have jurisdiction over one particular area. So the federal government has jurisdiction in protecting the borders of New Jersey, according to the Constitution. And then New Jersey has the ability, the state legislators have the ability to do even more, and that is to make sure that commerce is conducted properly, make sure contracts are adhered to, the police power of establishing law and order and punishing crime. These were the initial purposes of government. The purpose of government was to secure our rights. The states were given greater jurisdiction in that. The federal government was given very, very limited power.
Right.
Of course, the federal government had to take on the states because the states succeeded during the Civil War. And that's why the 14th Amendment, the first 10 amendments, Elizabeth, were primarily due to restricting the federal government's power. But the great debate that existed within the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was, how much power are we going to give the federal government? How much power are we going to have given the states? And this is why we have this, to this day, this debate over federalism versus anti-federalism. And the founders never anticipated the federal government to be the behemoth that it is. But the states have been just as unconstitutional in depending upon the federal government for subsidies, as opposed to managing their own affairs. So it's a total dichotomy between the states and the federal government. And the idea is that they work together, but the only way they can do that effectively, Elizabeth, is if they adhere to the Constitution. And we have a great tutor. We have a great resource that we can go to understand what federalism really is and what it should be. And that's the Federalist Papers. Yeah. Reading the Federalist Papers and reading also the Anti-Federalist Papers, which are very important. And every representative and anyone interested in political theory should be reading the Federalist Papers. They are as relevant today as they were in 1789.
Absolutely. You know, JR, it makes me wonder if we shouldn't be pushing for a bill that would require a certain amount of education for newly elected officials for not only our founding documents as a nation, but those of New Jersey or wherever they are elected. It seems to me that that would be key to do. We certainly cannot assume that they have that knowledge. Our education system is not providing it as it used to, certainly not when you and I were growing up. Let's talk about the New Jersey Constitution a little bit, because it's interesting to note that our governor is amongst the most powerful in the nation based on our Constitution. So what makes the New Jersey Constitution so unusual? And I wonder if many of its citizens even understand it or have ever looked at it, or even operate under the idea that there is this separate, of course, governing document for the state. So what is so unique and special about the New Jersey State Constitution?
Well, for one thing, Elizabeth, in 1947, the Constitution was revised. And unfortunately, the influences of progressivism, unfortunately, the influences of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, unfortunately, the political theory of Woodrow Wilson were very influential in giving the executive branch more power. And of course, FDR was indicative of that in the New Deal, guiding and proposing legislation that the Constitution says that the Congress is solely responsible for.
That's right.
And it's the responsibility of the executive, Elizabeth, to enforce and execute the laws that are created by Congress. But now the governor himself has become a legislator. Phil Murphy arbitrarily decided we're going to have mail-in voting. Well, that's unconstitutional. That's supposed to be the responsibility of the legislative branch. Now, they came along later, but that's not the way the process is to work. And that only deprives the people of their rights. That's a clear, stark example of that. But the 1947 Constitution had a great amount of influence from progressivism. And that's why the governor in New Jersey is given more power. But we need to go back to the Constitution. Article 3 says that all of the branches are to be equal, and not one government or not one branch of government is to blur the lines of the other. And that means they're given enumerated specific responsibilities, which we read of in Article 4 for the legislature, Article 5 for our executive branch, and then Article 6 for the Supreme Court of the state. If we adhered to the Constitution and we had representatives who were adhering to the Constitution, our rights would never be infringed upon. And if they were, they would be very, very rare indeed. But because the elected representatives perhaps don't even know the Constitution, that's normally what is occurring, or some just go ahead and ignore it and believe, well, it's obsolete. We've moved on. Progressivism, we're evolving, we're changing. And that's why we've gotten away from the Constitution. But the Constitution was originally written, and as it reads today, Elizabeth, is very clear. Article 1 is rights and privileges of the people. That means it says that people are independently free and independent, and that all political power is held by the people. This is what the Article 1 of our Constitution says. Now, do you think that the Democrats and Phil Murphy took that into consideration with the response to the COVID-19 lockdown? Not at all. And it's the responsibility of the Republicans, it's the responsibility of our elected Republicans in New Jersey to defend the rights and privileges, Article 1 of our Constitution, and keep to be obedient to our Constitution.
Well, JR, let's talk about that perfect storm that sort of has happened in New Jersey in the past 2 years of the COVID world, because you are absolutely right. There was no balance. So we've got a governor who dictated those things that he wanted to see, or his party wanted to see, or whomever was calling the shots. Lots of executive orders, unconstitutional things that he did that he later then, in some cases, got the legislator to pass. We, of course, have two houses, which are heavily in his hand, not pushing back against him. And then with all of that, the Republican Party either unable to, unwilling, or in some way just simply not holding his feet to the fire, or the Democrats, in terms of what is considered to be our constitutional right and what is obviously unconstitutional. And then on top of that, though, JR, that which is supposed to protect us when all of that fails is the court system. And that is really ultimately where we can go to get relief and say, this is an unconstitutional law, this is an unconstitutional order, this was an unconstitutional act. What's going on with our judicial system in New Jersey? Because that is supposed to be what ultimately catches the misdeeds and the missteps of the elected officials, is it not? And do we actually have a fully functioning judicial system in this state that is blind, or are they in fact affected by the political parties, in your opinion?
Well, number one, Elizabeth, you have to remember that the founders intended the legislative branch and the executive branch to practice judicial review, that they were supposed to be formulating, creating law commensurate with the Constitution. And the Supreme Court was the third and the last, and the founders anticipated, as the Federalist Papers say, that the Supreme Court and the courts should take a back seat to both. The legislature comes first, it's closest to the people, they're 2-year terms. There's a revolving door. They are out there with their constituents. They're running for re-election every 2 years. They are the most involved with their people. And the executive branch was merely to enforce those laws. So the Supreme Court now is on top. It's just totally backwards from what the founders intended. And of course, when you have governors who are appointing progressive and activist judges, like we have completely on the New Jersey Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Radmer, these are progressives. These are ardent progressives who believe in a living Constitution, an evolving Constitution. They gave Phil Murphy the okay to consider the COVID-19 a crisis, which the legislature should define what is a crisis. Right. And then Phil Murphy using executive orders, Elizabeth, which are unconstitutional. They're not found anywhere in the state constitution, nor are they found in our federal constitution.
Amazing.
Executive orders were initially intended for the administrative, or for the executive administration, were only applicable to those who were within his cabinet and those who were helping him within his administration, not to the electorate, not to the citizens. So the state needs to take this up. And I've mentioned this to Senator Orho, and that is to clearly define what a crisis is, and then also restrict the force of law, executive orders, impose upon the liberties and the rights of the people. And like I said, and like the founders understood, Elizabeth, and this is important for the people to realize, they believe that the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the courts should all be practicing judicial review, creating, enforcing, and interpreting law according to the Constitution.
Well, we are clearly way out of balance. So I have to ask you, should a Republican be elected governor in this state, would you still be against the executive orders, or would you see a need for them to be used to right the ship a bit, or is it just simply the wrong way to go?
Well, it's not in the Constitution. The executive orders aren't part of our Constitution, statewide or nationwide, and they have been abused. They've been terribly abused. They have the force of law. One of the reasons nationally, Elizabeth, we have an economic issue and high inflation is because we stopped producing our own energy. And that's only been done by the force of Joe Biden and his executive orders.
Correct.
It's as if the Green New Deal never passed legislation, never passed the Congress and the Senate, but yet it's being implemented by the president. That is not the way the Constitution was written. The president had very limited duties. Most of them were primarily involved with foreign nations and protecting our borders. And we don't even do that properly. And that's because we don't adhere to the Constitution. But I believe, and I've talked to Jack Ciattarelli about this, and he believes in restoring the preeminence of the Constitution. And he said during the campaign that he would refuse to give in to the temptation of using executive orders and allow the legislature to do their job. And then he would bring that bill before him, and he would sign the law if it was just, or he would veto. So that's the mentality that an executive should have as governor of the state of New Jersey.
Let's talk a little bit about the two parties, because of course that, impacts what we see happen in Trenton, what we see happen in DC. I think we can agree that the Democrat Party has gotten more progressive and liberal. They're certainly not the party of Kennedy that I remember. I do remember that a tiny bit, not much. But they're certainly not that same.
You're not that old, Elizabeth.
I know, but I remember what I remember.
You're not that old.
That's true. But, we also look at the Republicans, and I think you make the argument that they've lost their way as well. And they need to be the upholders of the Constitution as they were historically. And we need to educate people on the fact that Republicans are actually the ones who historically did that. Now, I want you to talk specifically about the issue that in 2020, there was no party platform. Now, I remember growing up, always there was a party platform. We learned about it in civics, about the planks of the platform and where that came from and all of that. What happened in 2020? How did we lose our way, and how do we regain and go back to that? What happened that there was no platform?
Well, interestingly enough, we actually created a New Jersey Constitutional Republican, or a Constitutional Republican platform that the viewers can see on our website at www.njcr4restore.com. We provided a platform, and that's very much based upon the original platform of 1856. It's only 17 planks, and it encapsulates everything that a Republican representative should be defending. And that is limited government, the return to local and state governments, protecting the right to life of the unborn from the moment of conception, which should be number one. The God-given unalienable right to life is the most important right. It is the first one, and Republicans should be defending that right. And we provided a platform. And as far as the national platform not being offered, it shows a lack of leadership from the top. It shows a lack of vision and leadership from the top. It shows a lack of commitment to Republican Party initial principles. And the Republican Party, the voters need to know what they're voting for, and Republican representatives need to know what they are defending, why they are running for office, what are their policies, what is their platform. And it's very, very important. See, one of the things, Elizabeth, that we know is that the president historically has been, the leader of the party. And I would suggest that the people need to be more involved, that the Republican voters themselves should have much more to do than the so-called powers that be in articulating and formulating the policy. But they're only going to be successful, Elizabeth, if they are constitutionally literate and they understand what the Constitution is, And then they'll be able to formulate policy based on the Constitution. We just talked about Article 1 of rights and privileges of the state of New Jersey, which gives the people the political, they are inherently the political power. Well, the Republican Party voters should be the power. We shouldn't acquiesce to a king or acquiesce to a personality. We should acquiesce to the principles before personality. And you evaluate the Republican leader or leaders or representatives on their commitment to those principles, not on a personal agenda.
Well, that's so good, JR. You know, it's we've become a society of the personality cult, right? Whoever is, you know, in any position that we're electing, we sort of, our fortunes sort of move in the direction of that individual rather than us, it being we the people. So I want you to look into your crystal ball, because, you know, America has a tendency to swing strongly in different ways. Are we swinging back, JR? Are there enough people like you who are passionately trying to get that clarion call out there to say, we've lost our way, not just as a party, but as a nation, in terms of understanding who we are, who we were meant to be. And that really clarifies everything once you know it. So look into your crystal ball and tell me, do you believe that we are going to come back to this, I'm going to say to the center, which is balance, right? Are we going to begin to see this being taught in our schools? Do you believe Americans have had enough and they're waking up?
Well, I'd have to say, in answering that very good question, Elizabeth, is I believe we still need to get the constitutional Republican message out to the people of New Jersey and the nation. And once we do that and we see that the people are indeed reading and learning and taking our classes on civics and the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and then learning about critical theory and progressivism and everything that has eroded our constitutional republic, all of that encompasses a lot of hard work and study. I think it's a little too early to tell, but I will say, on a rather ominous note, that we see a division. We see a polarization that we have not seen since the Civil War in this country. And we've talked about the Democrats and progressivism, but really they've moved towards Marxism.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you can tell. That's what you can easily evaluate from AOC and the Squad and many of the leaders of the Democratic Party. They're Marxists. They're not only progressives. Of course, Marx thought he was a progressive as well. But the fact of the matter is that we see a great polarization. We see division like we've never seen. We see the division within our Republican Party. We see. I've seen the parent party just a day or two ago. I've seen other parties now that are trying to come about, and what they should be doing is supporting the Republican Party and coming with the constitutional Republican movement, because the principles of the Declaration, the adherence to the Constitution, once the people know that, Elizabeth, that will resonate with the greatest number of voters. Yes. We can still reach those independents. We can still reach those disgruntled Democrats. I talk to Democrats all the time that are fed up. They believe that the party's moved too far to the left, towards Marx. And until we can get them all involved, and of course, you know, Elizabeth, that the Republican Party has traditionally been a factional party. There's been a conservative element. There's been a pro-life element. There's been a fiscal conservative element. There's been all sorts of, and we go back to the beginning of the party. The abolitionist movement was different from the unionist movement. So we've always been factional, but we've generally, when we've won and been successful, we've been able to come together and we've been able to form a coalition. And we need a leader who will build that coalition. We need a Lincoln, someone who will build a coalition, not turn people off, not discourage people, not demean them, but to bring them into the fold. You know, Lincoln said, Elizabeth, that he who controls the public sentiment, or I don't believe control would be the right word there, I'm paraphrasing, but he who has, or he who taps into the public sentiment will be those leading the party. And we have to tap into the more rational and just element of our party. And as we talk about, go back to the laws of nature, nature's God, to start all of it. If a law is not commiserate with the laws of nature, nature's God, then it's no law at all.
Well, so the good news. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
listen, the good news, JR, is that I think people are running here and there looking for a solution, creating new things, and people are upset and people are on edge, and there certainly is a lot of unrest. But the good news is that we don't need a new solution. We just need to go back to the basics and understand what we were already given, which is the greatest gift really you could be given as a country and as a society. And so knowing that and educating people on that, I think would help people understand that they don't need to create something new. They simply need to adhere to that which we were already given. And to that end, you are trying to do that, which we appreciate all the efforts that you make. You really know what you're talking about. And if people want to learn more from you, to get involved, to follow you, to understand what you are trying to help this state and this country with, where do they go? Besides, I know your website is njcr4, the number 4, restore.com. What do they find on that website?
Well, they'll see it's a work in progress, Elizabeth. We've just had up, but they will see the events that will be coming up. We have events coming next week that the people can see. We also have our meeting next week, our monthly meeting that we have. And I'll be speaking in Tom's River at the Berkeley GOP next Monday evening at 7:00. And looking forward to a great turnout there. We'll be supporting the Washington Township down here in South Jersey Republicans on their trivia night for Saturday night. We have many Constitutional Republicans involved with them, but also our Facebook pages, our Facebook New Jersey Constitutional Republicans Facebook group page. We also have the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans, which is primarily a business page, but we put a lot of information up there. And we also have Elizabeth Constitutional Republican Academia, which gives a lot of study material, academic materials substantiating what we believe in restoring the preeminence of the Declaration of Independence, its principles, and the Constitution protects it. But I thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say, Elizabeth, that the American people and the citizens of New Jersey must demand more from their representatives.
Amen.
They must hold their representatives to a higher standard. And they need to know, the citizens, the voters need to know the Constitution and the Declaration. And then they need to hold their elected representatives to knowing the Constitution, because the Constitution and the structure of the Constitution, the limited enumerated duties, the separation of powers, that is what protects our natural rights. It's not the first 10 amendments as much as it is the structure. We've gotten away from the structure. It's become convoluted. We need to restore that structure, but the people must demand more from their representatives. And that's what we are going to continue to proclaim.
Well, JR, I think I can say that our founding fathers would have very much enjoyed conversing with you. I think you have their spirit, and I admire that. I actually think that's really cool, in a simple term, because you get it, and that's alive and well in you and those that are fighting for that. So thank you for everything you're doing. We'll hear more from you in the future. We'll be all working together to get back to what was intended, so we can continue to pursue happiness, right? And great lives in this incredible country and this state. So JR, thank you so very much. And to my audience, please check out more about the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans. You'll be amazed at what you find out. Don't be afraid to learn, teach your children. That's where freedom is in knowledge. Thank you so much, JR.
Thank you.